Family trips make great memories. Once we were visiting a park with a lake, and Evelyn, who was about 4 years old, was standing at the edge throwing rocks into the water. My husband, Aaron, saw a great big mosquito on her leg. He didn't want her to have a huge bite, so he ran up to swat the mosquito. But he overestimated the amount of force it would take to squish the bug, and instead, the energy of his motion was pushed into her leg, knocking her off balance, and she fell forward right into the freezing cold water. Or at least that's what he claims happened. None of the rest of us saw the mosquito. We still laugh about it. Family outings are not only the great source of memories, but they're also a chance to learn. Today, we're going to talk about how the experience of throwing rocks into water can prepare you to understand one of the most basic principles of science, the motion we call a wave. Hello, I'm your host, Miriam Brown. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's in curriculum and instruction. I spent the last decade as a public school teacher, and I want to give you insider tips on how to help your child do well in public school. Elementary school spends so much time learning about reading and writing that there isn't always enough time for science. At home, science is one of the most entertaining things you can learn with your child. When Jackson was in elementary school, his teacher asked what his parents did, and he said, "Oh, they're both scientists." That was sort of true. My husband is a doctor. He studies science, but wouldn't call himself a scientist. And I was a stay at home mom at the time. But since I'm constantly experimenting with things, he figured I was a scientist too. And in the most basic sense of the word, I was. But nobody pays me for my experiments. So why do I do science with my kids? I do love it. But unlike reading and math, it's not something you have to teach your children every day. I am very conscientious about bedtime stories and counting with young children, but science is either a random conversation or a special planned activity. In fact, I'm going to be honest with you and tell you that doing science at home won't really make or break their success in public school. I do science with my kids mainly because it's fun. It creates a sense of excitement about the awesomeness of the world around us that is just so positive. It's also a wonderful way to teach critical thinking and problem solving skills. There's an easy way to help your kid develop scientific thinking. Most of them are born curious, so it's pretty simple to turn a random question into a scientific exploration. Sometimes we're so exhausted with all the work involved in parenting that our kids' curiosity can actually be kind of annoying. I'm so grateful to Alexa because she's very patient about answering Yogi's random questions. But as parents, we can turn a why question into an interesting conversation. Often, I don't know the answer to my child's questions, but a scientist isn't a know it all. A true scientist can say, "I don't know." But instead of being okay with "I don't know," they try to figure out the answer. This is a thinking habit that unfortunately school really discourages in children. The teacher simply doesn't have time to go down random rabbit holes when there are 24 rabbits in the classroom. So when my child asks me a question that I don't know the answer to, I respond by saying, that's a really good question. If I add, "What do you think?" they're just going to say, "I don't know. That's why I asked you." I figured out a response that would help tip them into more scientific ways of looking at things. I said, that's a good question. Let's make some guesses. Then we would take turns making guesses. The word guess allows kids to avoid the pressure of being right, and it allows them to really open up their minds. Some of my kids would engage their imaginations and come up with magical or fantastical stories to explain things, which was actually pretty fun. Science can turn into creative writing if you want it to, but I always try to teach scientific vocabulary, so I say, "That is a really interesting hypothesis." For sure, they ask me what the word hypothesis is, and then I just tell them it's a scientific guess. The more you use it, the easier it'll be for them when they start learning about hypothesis in school. With younger kids, encouraging questions and hypotheses is a great way to start critical thinking. But as they get older, you can move on to the next skill in scientific thinking, which is developing a way to test a hypothesis. It's pretty easy. You just say, that's a good hypothesis. I wonder how we could test that. Thinking about ways to test our guesses is the very basis of scientific inquiry. Some of my children's best at home science lessons have come from creating ways to answer those questions. For example, my 7-year old Evelyn wanted to know how fast her kittens would grow up. We ended up weighing and measuring those kittens every day and making a graph. I think she sort of regretted asking the question by the time we were done. Another time, she wanted to know how many worms lived in our yard, and Google didn't have the answer. So we ended up scooping out dirt from different parts of the yard and counting how many worms each scoop had. We found lots of worms in the vegetable garden, but practically none in the dirt by the road. Then, since we realized that the amount of worms was different in different parts of the yard, we were too lazy to do the complicated math. But it was still fun, and we learned a lot about different types of soils. If you're a busy family, you don't actually have to test all of their ideas. Sometimes, if they're curious enough, they just might do their own experiments. How far you take these science questions will depend on the amount of time you have to play science with them. But it's perfectly fine just to leave it conversational. It still helps them develop critical thinking skills. Not all of my kids have been curious about scientific ideas, so sometimes I plan scientific adventures. Usually I do this when they have days off. Yogi knows that if he stays homesick from school, we're going to be doing homeschool science. This usually involves watching YouTube videos and doing a simple activity. So don't get overwhelmed thinking that you have to add science to your daily list of things to worry about teaching your child. But it never hurts to have ideas for activities to do on a rainy day. When I told my son in medical school that I was doing this podcast on wave science, he said, "I thought you were sticking to grade levels. Aren't you in first grade?" But yes, waves are a first grade standard because they are so central to our lives. Even if you're not a surfer, you interact with waves all the time. You can see things because light waves travel from the sun or from a light bulb and bounce off objects before they reach your eyes. You can hear because sound waves travel from vibrating objects through the air to your ear. You probably cook with microwaves, use Wi Fi, and listen to the radio. These are all examples of energy traveling in waves. Today, we're just going to talk about waves in water. Kids love to throw rocks in puddles, ponds, or even lakes. Throwing rocks into water is something fun to do with your family on the weekend, and it's free. But instead of just throwing or skipping rocks, you can get your child into scientific observation mode. You can say, "Look how the water moves after you throw a rock in. What do you notice?" They'll probably notice how the ripples spread outward from where the rock landed. If they're really observant, they might notice how the rings of ripples get farther and farther apart as they move outward. They might even see a little drop of water burst out of the center of the ring of ripples. Your kid might come up with some follow up experiments, but if they don't, you could suggest some. What happens to the waves if you throw two rocks at the same time? Even if you don't have any water nearby, you can make waves in the bathtub. We got in the habit of putting less water in Evelyn's bath because, as a toddler scientist, she used to like to slide down the side of the bathtub into the water to watch it make waves.
Whee! Good slide.
Let's big slide.
Look.
Do another slide.
Do another slide, okay.
Another baby one.
Another baby one, all right. Whew.
She only did a small slide that time because she wanted to make a smaller wave, and she had observed that if she slid from farther up on the bathtub, it made a big wave. You will need a mop or a lot of towels for the bathtub wave making experiment, but you can make a less messy one using a small wave simulator by filling an empty bottle with half water and half oil. You can look up a video on YouTube to show you how to do it. But if you rock the bottle gently back and forth, you'll make waves that you can observe from the top, the bottom, or from the side. An interesting experiment you could do in your bottled ocean or in your bathtub is to put a floating object in and see if the waves will move the object from one end of your container to the other or if they just bob up and down. Hint, the object will mostly move up and down because the water isn't going back and forth, only the energy in the wave is. There's a visual explanation of why this happens on pbslearningmedia.org. I'll post a link in the show notes. I also like to use digital wave simulators in my classroom. I've found that kids love them because they can easily change things on the screen and do little digital experiments. I'll link my favorite one from the University of Colorado's PhET website. It is a little interactive digital simulation of a wave container. In the water version, it's a sink with a faucet. If you press the button on the faucet, it makes a drip into the sink, and kids can observe the ripples radiating outward from the top of the sink, or they can switch to the side view and see how the water drips make the surface water move up and down in waves. They can also play around with how fast the drips fall, which changes the wave frequency, or how big the falling drips are, which will change the amplitude. If you've just tuned out because I used big science words, that's okay. You don't actually have to teach this to your kid. You can learn alongside them. When I have students use simulators, I usually just pull up the simulator for them and let them play around with the buttons for a while. Most will only be interested for a minute or two, but some will want to play with it for a really long time. The benefit of doing this at home versus in the classroom is you can gauge how interested they are and stop when they're bored. In a classroom, you usually have half the kids bored in 30 seconds and the other half disappointed when you make them move on after 15 minutes. After I let the kids play with the simulator for as long as they want, I ask questions like, what did you notice happening when you moved this slider? This one that changed the frequency? Or maybe I might ask, how does the movement of the water look different if you're looking at the top versus the side? Try to make sure all the observations are coming from them and don't tell them anything. You just want them to start noticing things and experimenting. You don't have to explain the science, especially if you don't understand it yourself. It's better not to. But the purpose is to get them noticing, wondering, and testing out what happens when you change things. So don't be intimidated if science wasn't your best subject in school. I had a hard time in school science because when I didn't understand something, it was hard for me to memorize it. As a teacher and a parent, I'm finding out that this learning obstacle would have actually made me an excellent scientist. One day, after teaching a lesson about waves, I was playing with the simulator myself, and I started coming up with all kinds of questions in my head. When I Googled those questions, I found that in the past 10 years, scientists with these same questions have made some outstanding new discoveries. I wasn't stupid because I was slow at memorizing science. I actually had an aptitude for questioning what was already known. While schools are great at teaching kids to memorize, they aren't very good at fostering creativity and critical thinking. With the rise of internet and AI, however, memorizing facts is becoming less and less valuable. Critical thinking and problem-solving skills are getting more and more valuable. Luckily for you, it's pretty easy to do and say small things at home that will help your child to learn to think like a scientist. You might even find these activities sparking your own curiosity, and you might find yourself wanting to know more and more. But for right now, it's time to put down your phone and go play with your kid.